When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject, Rust. User, Turner84. Posted, March 12, 1998.
Carl Merriman wasn't a good man by anyone's definition of the term. He was a cruel, sometimes violent father, an inattentive husband, an untrustworthy business associate, and yet, if you were to ask anyone around Erie County about him, they'd tell you exactly the opposite. You'd hear stories about the long-time contributions to the Elks Club, from his auto-wrecking business, or his beautiful daughter, Mina, a dental assistant in Erie. His son Eddie, it would be said, was such a trooper, having survived a terrible car crash out there on the West Coast, followed by multiple surgeries to repair his face. No matter who you spoke to, none of them would ever tell you the truth about the way he used to beat the boy or the midnight visits to his daughter's room. Here, when the legend of a man's goodness becomes fact, you print the legend. I'd never given much, if any, thought to the final cost of all those lies. That's just not what you do in a place like Union City. They fester beneath the surface, infecting all of us in our own way. Seen in that light, we shouldn't be surprised that Rust found his way to our town. Maggie Conrad grew up here in Union, went to school in Pittsburgh, and came back to Erie as a detective, working for the municipal police. She was a reserved woman, tall and athletic, with coal-black hair perpetually pulled back into a ponytail. Her partner, Chris Warren, was essentially her male counterpart, albeit blonde and with a gregariousness Maggie didn't possess. They were the responding detectives on the cold January morning Carl Merriman was found torn to pieces by the teeth of his own car shredder. The last anyone had heard from him was a call to his wife Ethel the night before, saying he was hung up trying to fix the shredder's control panel and not to expect him home until late. He hadn't come home at all. In case anyone might be tempted to think of this as some terrible accident, 6 words had been smeared on the white wall of Merriman's storage building in a thick, reddish-brown substance later tests would identify as the man's blood. Carl Anthony Merriman, Rust to Rust. None of us knew what it meant. Interviewing the bereaved is never an easy thing to do, navigating the tangle of their grief over lives both lived and not. All I have to go by is Chris's notebook, but it seems as though he and Maggie did the best they could. Ethel Merriman is, or I should say, was, a woman accustomed to dictating the terms of her own life, and it wouldn't surprise me if she'd felt just as insulted as she did victimized by someone else being able to have such an outsized influence on it. one of her primary concerns was how the nature of the murder would reflect on her dance studio. Eddie, the prodigal son, had come home to Union City after a long period of hospitalization, but was not home during the interview. Chris notes that when they did finally have a chance to sit down with him, the young man's reconstructive surgeries had left him unrecognizable to Maggie, who had known him growing up. Eddie's relationship with his father had been marked by violence and intimidation, so it came as no surprise that the detectives found him casually indifferent to both the fact and method of the older man's death. The daughter, Mina, felt similarly and declined to come home to UC for the funeral, which should fill in the rest of the picture. Town selectman Ralph Ames, one of our wealthiest citizens, gave the eulogy for Merriman. The two, along with their wives, were members of the Concord Club, a members-only social club headquartered in one of Ames's buildings downtown. Despite rumors around what goes on at the Concord circulating around town as long as I'd been running the newspaper, if not longer, I'd never been able to find anyone willing to talk on the record. The little I have heard is disgusting. Proof nothing is beyond the corrupting influence of wealth, certainly not innocence. The sad fact of the matter is that even if I'd had a reliable source, the Concord Club members would never have let me print the story. My office building back then was an Ames property, and Mayor Bert Hallenbeck owned Coral Press, who printed my paper. The wealthy had an iron grip on truth back then. After the funeral, Maggie and Chris were at a dead end. No pun intended. The junkyard had been open to the public for so long that forensics turned up enough boot prints and fingerprints to implicate everyone in Union City. It put them in the unenviable position of waiting to see if another body dropped. They didn't have long to wait. Ethel Merriman was next, crucified alive above the front door of her dance academy outside city limits around 11 p.m. In a twist of fate so unlikely I wouldn't have believed it without seeing the police report, Maggie had been seeing Trooper Levin since his divorce and was driving home from Levin's house when she heard Ethel's screams. The killer we would come to call Rust, wearing a black hooded jacket, had only just finished piercing Ethel's side with a lance of white pine when Maggie's truck screeched to a halt at the base of the academy's concrete steps. Beneath the bound woman's wriggling body were another 6 words. Ethel Alice Merriman, rust to rust. The hooded figure wound up as if to throw the spear at Maggie, but she was faster, drawing her pistol and firing a warning shot. It was enough. He placed the spear on the ground and, at her order, lay face down. Once the killer was cuffed, Maggie rolled him over to discover it was Eddie Merriman, or at least that's what we all thought at the time. The boy had done such a thorough job of fixing Ethel's body to the school, Maggie was unable to get her down, and she bled out before emergency services could arrive. As for Eddie, he was taken to the lockup in Erie for questioning. It's here the story becomes fractured. All of his identification named him as Eddie Merriman, but his fingerprints didn't match those Erie PD had on file from a long-ago class visit made by his elementary school. While fingerprints may expand over time, they do not change, meaning the man who sat in their interrogation room was not who he appeared to be. So, where was Eddie Merriman? And who was his cuckoo who had come home in his place? I've seen the interview tapes recorded that night and the following day. It's difficult to describe the chill I felt watching them, as if they were recording not so much a man as a hole in the world shaped like one. His voice was flat, eyes bright but empty, like those of an animal. When the identity fraud was discovered, he told Maggie and Chris to simply call him Rust because, in his words, "Wherever there's darkness and filth, you'll find me eating away at the old world so a new one can be born." By mid-morning the following day, the detectives had managed to solve at least one mystery: the fate of Eddie Merriman, the real one. There had been an accident, just not a head-on collision followed by a hospital stay. Eddie was the victim of a hit-and-run, killed in Hollywood at the corner of Hawthorne and North La Brea. He had been buried under a different name, one given by the person who claimed his remains, a person who matched the description of the man in custody, now calling himself Rust. The following is transcribed directly from the interrogation in question. Speaking are Detective Chris Warren and the unidentified suspect. Detective Conrad had been called into the front office by a visit from Mayor Ames.
Did you kill Eddie too?
Eddie had been dead for a long time. He was like a cow who's been struck by the hammer and staggers away instead of falling down. Only alive in a technical sense. His parents and everyone at their social club killed him a very long time ago. All I did was finish the job.
What does the Concord Club have to do with this?
Detective, you can't be that naive. What happens when wealth is hoarded? It corrupts, it rots, it consumes. Purity is its first victim.
And you defend purity. Is that what you're saying?
Not at all, Detective. I'm a consequence, nothing more. I go where I'm set. When my work is done, I go somewhere else and start all over again.
Rust's voice trails off here, dropping too low to be heard by either the camera or Detective Warren. After a minute or so of this, Warren approaches the suspect, telling him to speak up. The attack happens so quickly it's barely visible on camera. Rust, handcuffed, lunges at Detective Warren, sinking his teeth into the taller man's neck. Blood gouts so far out from the wound it slashes across the camera lens, tinting the image crimson as if the world itself had been turned red by the attack. Warren, eyes wide with shock and fear, tries desperately to hold his hand over the ragged hole with no luck. He crumples to the ground, followed by Rust, who, off camera, retrieves a handcuff key from the dead man's pocket. Seconds later, and he's gone. In addition to handcuff keys, Rust took Detective Warren's car keys and was gone before anyone clocked the murder. Maggie was the one who found her partner's body only minutes after Rust had vanished. A manhunt was organized to scour both Erie and the townships beyond. State troopers, civilians, anyone who could lend a hand did. It amounted to nothing. In time, we learned that Rust had gone straight to the Concord Club, picking the lock on a kitchen entrance at the back, resecuring it behind himself, then hiding in the drop ceiling. Stades had 2 cruisers on the exterior of the building and even did a sweep, but with everything locked up tight, there was no reason for them to do more than a cursory search. An emergency meeting of the club was called, members arriving to the squat brick building separately, escorted by men toting shotguns and rifles. Each of the arrivals represented a position of power in Erie County, and each had been part of the many nightmarish stories told about the club. The nature of the business being discussed was such that once it was established the building was secure, guards were instructed to wait outside and keep watch. 12 men and 4 women went into the Concord Club that night. At some point, it appears as though Rust lowered himself down from his hiding place and tore through the attendees with a series of kitchen knives as if they were on a slaughterhouse conveyor belt, which I suppose is exactly what they were. Soundproofing, apparently added at some point in the club's past to keep its activities private, kept the guards and stadies outside from hearing the massacre inside. When someone finally went in to check on the proceedings, it was all over. Gleaming entrails hung from light fixtures like grotesque party streamers dripping down onto a lake of blood where once a laminate floor had been. Flayed faces, their shocked expressions edged with raw, pink skin, adorned the walls. Law enforcement confiscated my photos of the slaughter, and frankly, I almost don't mind. No one should have to look at something like that more than once in their life. As for Rust, he seems to have simply slipped away. Another manhunt, this one statewide and led by Maggie, was begun, and just like before, accomplished nothing. As soon as it was called off, she packed a bag with clothes and her notes on the Rust case and left Union City without so much as a letter of resignation. It's been 2 years now without any word. Her apartment has been cleared out and re-rented. The Concord Club was also cleared out, gutted, if you'll forgive my using that word, rebuilt, and I've heard the Moose Lodge will be taking over in the summer. You're no doubt wondering why you haven't read any of this in a newspaper or seen it on hard copy, and the answer is simple. The story was suppressed. As previously mentioned, my photos were seized by the same law enforcement agency who discouraged me from reporting any version of it. Even with the guilty dead, there was a status quo to maintain. For all his talk about clearing the way for a new world, Rust fits right into the old one, another monster hiding in the darkness beneath our beds. And Maggie? I believe she's still out there, trying to drag him out into the light.
Subject, Darkness Falls. User, 82 Midwest Rail. Posted, September 12, 1994.
Several times in my life, I've encountered what I can only describe as a black mist. I don't know where it comes from or why, but it's appeared not only to me, but to other people who are with me, so I know it's real. You feel it first as sort of all-over antsiness that slowly morphs into dread. The hair on your arm stands up, you feel a headachy sort of tugging in the center of your forehead, and then full body chills. The mist first appeared when I was a boy. I grew up in Peoria, Illinois, in a small house by the railroad. My bedroom was on the second floor, facing out toward the train tracks, and when big freights rolled through, you could see the ground gently move like you were on board a cruise liner. The night it happened, one of those freights had just passed when the sense of restlessness set in. The air above my bed became darker, like my eyes were clouding, except when I looked to the left and right, I could see just fine. The darkness coalesced into a mist, roughly the length of my body, maybe a foot over top of me. Inexplicably, I don't remember how that time ended. I think I might have passed out, but in subsequent appearances, the mist would eventually fade away. It never stopped being unsettling, but over time, you can get used to just about anything. That it might have been something medical or neurological never occurred to me, and back then you didn't really tell your parents anything they didn't need to know, so no one pressured me to see a doctor. Eventually, my first girlfriend, Annie, saw it too, so the reality of the experience was confirmed that way. Thing is, something happened recently which has me concerned. I'm in my 20s now and recently married to the love of my life, Carol. After our wedding, we bought a house in South Bend, Indiana, and did it up as best we could with the money we had at our disposal. We plan on continuing to fix it up over time, or at least planned. The incident I'm going to tell you about has me wondering if there's any time left at all. It's summer right now, and the long country sunsets are one of our favorite things about living in the Midwest. In the evenings, Carol and I like to sit out on the front porch and play cribbage as we watch the blue and the sky darken to black. Our street is lined with houses similar to ours, though our neighbors are less inclined to be outside in the evening, and sometimes the suburban emptiness can be eerie. Still, we love being out there, and sometimes our example encourages a few others to do the same. I'd like to think we can work on them and maybe liven the place up a bit. On this night, we were the only ones outside, but the streetlights had come on, and from our porch, we could hear the diffuse sounds of evening traffic only a couple blocks away. Strangely, Carol noticed the restlessness first. She put down her cards on the wooden folding table and looked at me. "Eddie," she said, "it's back." A moment later, it hit me too, but stronger than ever before. I thought I was going to jump out of my skin. The dread when it came was more powerful, and I felt hollow inside, as if I was a dead man waiting for the shroud. My throat went dry, a lump forming that prevented me from swallowing. I could barely breathe. My skin marbled into goose flesh, and the slingshot tugging between my eyes threatened to cave my entire head in. The panic was enough it took me several moments to notice the silence. Gone were the diffuse sounds of traffic, the hum of cicadas. As if from a great distance, I heard Carol gasp and fought my body to turn toward the street or where it had just been. You see, instead of our cozy little suburban street, our porch looked out onto an endless sea of black mist. It swirled and eddied, driven by currents we couldn't hear or feel. Carol was speaking, but I couldn't hear her. My head may as well have been wrapped in cotton, and the world swam. I lost consciousness. When I awoke again, I was in the back of an ambulance, Carol and a paramedic by my side. According to her, my eyes had rolled back in my head and I'd hit the ground hard. A moment later, the mist dissipated and the world had returned. I lost count of how many tests the doctors ran on me over the next couple days, but everything came back clear. I was a perfectly healthy man in what one of them called the prime of my life. I don't feel as though I'm in the prime of my life, though. Since that night, I've been filled with a single, awful certainty that the darkness we saw was a preview of things to come. The question I'm still wrestling with is whether it's coming just for me or for all of us.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.